channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo, bringing you good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. It is never dull on a Sunday morning. Last week, Rishi Sunak sacked Nadhim Zahawi. This week, Liz Truss has stepped back into the political limelight, blaming others for the short life of her government. Tomorrow, the National Health Service will face the biggest day of trade union disruption in its history. Nurses will start a 2-day walkout and ambulance teams will also be on strike. Even when its employees do work, does the NHS work anymore? Last summer, holidaymakers suffered cancelled flights and horrific queues at airports. Will this summer bring more chaos? And what does a food critic do apart from eat at the best restaurants and sample the finest food and wine? I lunch with restaurant critic William Sitwell. All that and a roller coaster of a history lesson. After the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you. It's 11:01. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Liz Truss claims she wasn't given a realistic chance to act on her policies when she was in office in her first major comments on her premiership since leaving Number 10. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, the former Prime Minister says she wasn't blameless in what happened, but criticised a lack of political support. She said she stands by her low-tax agenda, calling it a break from leftwards thinking within the party. Ms Truss resigned after 49 days following economic turmoil caused by her mini-budget. Earlier on GB News, Business Secretary Grant Shapps defended the government's economic plans.
I think that Liz's instincts are very conservative in the sense that we want to see taxes, lowered over a period of time. But I think everyone recognises we've been through, hell with coronavirus, which added, £400 billion at least of expenditure. We then had a war in Ukraine, which has pushed up energy prices and inflation and been very, very costly.
Police say a key witness in the search for missing mother of two, Nicola Billy, has now come forward. Officers appealed for a woman seen on CCTV footage wearing a yellow coat and pushing a pram in the area where the dog walker disappeared in Lancashire last Friday. Well, our national reporter Theo Chicombra is in St Michael's on Wire. Theo, what's the latest?
It's 10 days on since the disappearance of mother of two, Nicola Billy, here in St Michael's on Wire. Last night, there was an appeal for a woman who walked along this road where I am in Garstang Road, or also known as Blackpool Road. She has come forward. She's one of a number of people who the police have been looking for this week and working alongside to establish what would have happened on that Friday morning. Today, the search continued. Members of the public, community and friends are out on force again alongside police and special forces who are out searching not just in this area but in the surrounding areas, of course. They're saying their investigation is going to continue. No time frame as of yet of how long this is going to continue, but they say they're going to do all they can. This road in particular is important, and they say plenty of cars, as you can see, go past here, and if anybody has any dash cam footage which might be helpful, particularly on that Friday last week, do get in touch and call 101 or 999 if it is urgent.
Theo, thank you very much. That's our national reporter there for us. The Nurses' Union has called on the Prime Minister to make a new pay offer in order to avoid next week's strikes. The head of the Royal College of Nursing, Pat Cullen, says a meaningful offer could avert the action. The NHS is facing what many are calling the biggest strike day the NHS has ever seen. That's as tens of thousands of nurses and ambulance staff in England are set to walk out tomorrow and Tuesday. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called the action regrettable, saying it will undoubtedly have an impact on patients. China says it strongly opposes the decision by the US to shoot down a suspected spy balloon, which was thought to be carrying out surveillance of sensitive military sites. Fighter jets brought it down over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South Carolina yesterday. Well, earlier that day, 3 airports were closed and airspace restricted in the southeast of the country after President Joe Biden vowed to take care of it. China, though, maintains it was a weather airship which had blown off course. A series of missile strikes by Russia have seriously damaged a university and a residential building in central Kharkiv. The blast on the Ukrainian city injured at least 3 people. However, British defence analysts say Moscow has made small advances in its attempt to encircle the city of Bakhmut, which has been the focus of Russian forces for weeks. It follows Ukraine's president saying the situation on the front lines in the east was getting tougher, with Russia adding more troops into battle. Pakistan's former president, General Pervez Musharraf, has died at the age of 79 following a prolonged illness. He died in hospital in Dubai, having been in a self-imposed exile since 2008. Musharraf, who seized power in a coup in 1999, oversaw rapid economic growth in the country. He survived several assassination attempts, including from Al-Qaeda and other militant Islamist groups. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Portillo.
Thanks, Tatiana. Last Sunday, just before Camilla Tominey went on air, Nadeem Zahawi was sacked. This week, claims of bullying against Dominic Raab are mounting. The Prime Minister is committed to an investigation that follows due process. Given the number of complainants, that inquiry could take a long time. And so, as with the Zahawi case, Rishi Sunak is condemned to a lengthy distraction that casts his party in a poor light, and the passage of time as we wait for a verdict makes him look indecisive. The price of being fair in politics is a high one. Meanwhile, Liz Truss is back in the headlines with a 4,000-word essay in the Sunday Telegraph, which blames a leftist British establishment for frustrating her policies and bringing about the failure of her government. Strikingly, she says that she was not warned by civil servants of the particular danger of a collapse of pension funds, the fear of which rapidly brought down her tax-cutting policies and indeed her administration. GB News political correspondent Catherine Forster joins me now. Reactions to Liz Truss are quite interesting. The government has poo-pooed what she has been saying. On the other hand, a moment ago, we had Roger Bolton, a well-regarded economist, saying that, of course, there was much in her policies that he respected. Either way, not good news for Rishi Sunak, I imagine, to have this debate resurrected. What do you think?
No, really deeply unhelpful for the Prime Minister, who's very keen to be talking about the 5 priorities that the government is trying to focus on. But instead, we're still hearing about Dominic Raab, the bullying allegations. Now Liz Truss has burst back onto the scene after 100+ days of being very, very quiet with this 4,000-word piece. And yes, it's deeply unhelpful because, of course, the Conservatives are 20 points behind in the polls. They've had a few get-togethers recently at which they've been told by people like William Hague and Isaac Levido, the election master, that there is a very, very narrow path to an election victory. But it depends absolutely on being united, on stopping the infighting, in uniting behind Rishi Sunak. And at the moment, there is very little evidence of that happening. Liz Truss basically saying, I was right, my approach was right, Trussonomics wasn't given the chance to prove that I had the right policies, and by implication that Rishi Sunak's policy of saying we can't cut taxes now, we've got to get inflation under control now, is wrong. OK, Liz Truss has shouldered a very small, I would say, amount of blame in saying that possibly it wasn't communicated well. But even then, she's saying that even if it had been communicated better, she doesn't think it would make any difference because, as she describes it, the left-leaning economic orthodoxy was against her. And she's including in that not just the Bank of England, but the Office for Budget Responsibility, Whitehall, the civil service, a lot of the international community. There was a condemnation, don't forget, from Joe Biden, from the International Monetary Fund, and from many within her own party, because of course Rishi Sunak had talked about fantasy economics, and she's also saying that, you know, the consensus over the last decade or so had been rather to the left and in favour of more spending. And of course the Conservatives have been in charge for the last 13 years. So very unhelpful for Rishi Sunak. I'm sure he wishes that she would just stay quiet, but I think there's very little chance of that.
Catherine, rather briefly, if you would, the Dominic Raab case strikes me as interesting because it is plausible that he simply was very firm with civil servants. He's being accused of bullying. But this is going to be investigated over a very long period, and that is going to be very damaging for the Prime Minister. There's no easy way out of it for him, for the Prime Minister.
No, there really isn't. And of course, Dominic Raab was one of Rishi Sunak's key supporters. He went out to push for him in the leadership campaign. He has been a great supporter of him. So very difficult. And as you say, bullying is very subjective. It's how you interpret it. But I would say that with up to 40 people now having spoken to Adam Tolley, KC, and 24 people involved in these formal complaints, it does seem difficult to see how Dominic Raab is going to be totally vindicated and found not to have been guilty of any wrongdoing, even though he is, of course, insistent that he has done nothing wrong whatsoever.
Yeah, it is going to be difficult, I think, to keep him, but we will see. Thanks to Catherine Foster. Tomorrow will be the biggest day of industrial action in the history of the National Health Service, as ambulance teams strike and nurses walk out for 2 days. The Prime Minister said that he would like to pay nurses more, but the NHS cannot afford to exceed what the pay review has awarded. The NHS is often said to be in crisis, but as patients wait years for surgery and struggle to see a GP even by video call, there are more calls than usual for reform. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has said, if we don't get real about reform, the NHS will die. He also backed gradually, quotes, phasing in a new system for GPs, turning family doctors into direct NHS employees. At the end of last month, the government did announce a new plan to tackle emergency care delays. It included increasing the ambulance fleet with 800 new vehicles and providing an extra 5,000 beds. Stephen Dorrell is a former Secretary of State for Health, and he joins me now. Welcome back to the programme, Stephen. I think the last time I spoke to you, broadly speaking, your position was that there were reforms in the pipeline and that we would do well to rely upon them. I just wonder, talking as a politician to me, if you would, for a moment, whether the Conservatives ought to be worried, though, that now it is the Labour Party which is talking about broader reform. Do you think that would appeal to the electorate?
Well, I actually think that's an opportunity for a Tory Health Secretary. Although you and I were both members of a Conservative cabinet, I'm now a Lib Dem. But as a Conservative Health Secretary, it always seemed to me to be an opportunity if you could align yourself on a cross-party basis and convince not just the people within the health and care system, always remembering you have to talk not just about the NHS, but about social care at the same time. If you could convince the internal audience and the broader audience that you were actually seeking to achieve something that was the basis of broad political consent. If I were Steve Barclay, I'd be looking to build bridges with Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer and with Daisy Cooper, who's the Lib Dem spokesman, in order to create a broad-based support for a programme of reform that has been going on, of course, for a long time in the health service and needs to be given a new sense of urgency.
One of the very unfortunate things about the National Health Service is that it has never had that sort of political consensus. It was created under a Labour government, but following a report that had been produced by the coalition government during the Second World War. But I'm just thinking the plan you just put forward there, I don't see Labour ever agreeing to that, because Labour always sees the National Health Service as its baby, its subject, its advantage over the Conservatives.
You're 100% right in that. The Labour like to regard the NHS as almost its private property, but they can't do that. And the job of a Tory health secretary is to make that as difficult as possible for them. Of course, if Steve Barclay sought to create explicit a joint programme, Labour would never agree to that. You're quite right. But if Steve Barclay picks up ideas that have been articulated on the public record by Labour spokespeople, and there are plenty of I think, quite sensible policies that are being talked about by Wes Streeting and his colleagues. If Steve Barclay picks those up and seeks to carry them through, it's quite difficult for Labour to make a great issue of principle in opposition to them.
And Stephen Dorrell, does that imply that you would favour a softly approach to reform? You wouldn't want some sort of big bang reform. You want to be moving, for example, to an insurance-based model, at least for parts of our treatment.
No, I think in particular for a Tory government, actually, I suspect this is true. I think if you talk to Tony Blair, you'd find he'd give you exactly the same answer. If you create a big bang in the health service in which the opinion of in which politicians set up in opposition to doctors and nurses, it's likely the doctors and nurses will win.
Stephen Dorrell, great to talk to you despite your change of party. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Professor J. Myron Thomas and Professor Jonathan Beard, who are both consultant surgeons. Thank you very much for joining us. Myron, when you were last here, you were talking about the importance of the doctor's contract. You thought it had gone badly wrong in the past. And now the Labour Party has proposed changing the doctor's contract, in fact, making, over a period of time, GPs employees of the National Health Service, making them salaried. Is that going in the right direction?
It could be, but it's going to cost a fortune. GPs are contracted to the health service rather than employed by the health service, and basically they can do as they like, and that's been one of the big problems. They can work as many hours as they like, they can employ as many locums as they like, and as we know, as I said last time, 57% of GPs work 3 days or less, and of course they only cover urgent and emergency care for essentially 40 hours a week, office hours. There's 4 times that number of hours in a week. They have no contribution whatsoever to urgent and emergency care.
You turned up in a pink jacket today. Is that because you're impressed by Labour's proposals for reform?
Just as a slight competition to you, Michael, but I think pink and orange do rather clash, so maybe we should...
We put someone between us, put Jonathan between us. But are you impressed by Labour's ideas?
I'm impressed by Wes Streeting, and I've written to him several times, and he hasn't replied to me, unfortunately. But
what are you impressed by?
I think I'm impressed by the reforms that he's suggesting. I'm particularly impressed by... He actually thinks the GP contract has got... The GP performance has got to change, and that really is absolutely true. I think the Royal College of GPs should issue a public apology to the public for the chaos that they've caused in the last 2 years, or since the beginning of lockdown. The fact that patients can't get hold of their GP, they can't see their GP face-to-face. And of course, as everybody knows, that's been one of the most important reasons why accident emergency is crammed with patients, because they can't see their GP. Go to an accident emergency, why not?
One of the other things you talked about when you were last with me on this programme was obesity.
Yeah.
Nothing from Labour on people taking more responsibility for their own health. Would you like to see that?
I think that's a very, very difficult point. You know, obesity is a terrible issue. I said that it's costing the Exchequer £58 billion a year. And, of course, we've got 15 million people with a BMI of basal metabolic rate of... No, what am I talking about?
A lot of obesity.
A lot of obesity. And what people don't seem to understand is the illness that it causes,
yes,
and premature death.
Well, the politicians should be brave enough to say that people have to take some more responsibility for their health, shouldn't they?
Absolutely, but You know, I think the other thing I said when I was in practice, I think if you ever spoke to a patient about losing weight, they would get very angry with you as well.
So delicate. Jonathan, when I last spoke to you, you were down the line, not in the studio, but you had talked about the logistical difficulties, just trying to get your patients onto the operating table in front of you in a timely manner. So is your attitude to the National Health Service now that it needs little logistical reforms, maybe best practice established in one place, spread out to other places, or does it need reform of the system? Where do you come down on that?
I think, well, I can only really talk about the hospital system,
yes, okay,
which is the meat in the sandwich. But I think it needs root and branch reform. I mean, it's not a national health service, is it? It's a national sickness service. And what Miriam's just been saying is absolutely right, and you've been saying, we need to stop people getting sick. I don't think we actually need many more hospital beds. I think what we need to do is stop people getting sick and having to go into hospital. But the hospital system is, you know, Stalin would be very impressed with the top-down management system we have in the NHS.
And those managers are not, by and large, doctors and surgeons?
No, they're not. And many of them haven't been trained well. They don't have formal management qualifications, whatever that might mean. But I'm a surgeon educator, and I had to undertake a further degree in education to be able to talk to educators, to become a teacher, and to understand how education works. And surely if you're going to become a manager, you should do some management training, proper management training, and more also about leadership and encouraging and empowering the staff.
I mean, talking of Stalin, I think the National Health Service employs 1.5 million people. Yes. I just cannot imagine how any organisation could be managed, even by very good managers, with 1.5 million. So I'm tempting you to say, does it need to be broken up in some way? Does it need to be regionalised? Do we need to introduce an insurance element?
I don't think the NHS can continue providing all it does for free. That's for sure. And how you get around for paying for that, I think, is a conversation to be had. And I certainly think we need a long-term plan that, as Stephen Dorrell said, includes all political parties. It's been a political football for too long, and ministers dabbling with it every time they get into power.
Here's the puzzle. The National Health Service can only be funded by the British people, although that can happen in different ways.
Yes.
At the moment, it's all done by the British people as taxpayers, pretty much all done that way.
Yes.
In other countries, some of it is done by the people also taking out insurance as well as paying taxes. Since it all comes from the people in the end, what would be the advantage of changing the system? Myra, maybe you want to have a go at that one.
I think it's too late to change back to an insurance-based system, I'm afraid. I think the NHS has been going for too long. We've got so used to it. But like any other business, what we need to do is to cut costs. And to start with, we need to cull the managing classes. There are more managers than patients in the NHS now. And for example, I would start with people like equality and diversity managers, for example. I was looking up this morning, the starting salary is
You're very welcome on GBNews.
The starting salary is about £48,000. And if you become a people and culture manager, which is the top of the scale, you can get shy of £100,000. And the other bit of quango that really grates on me is NHS providers. Do you know, NHS, you're shaking your head, you don't know what NHS providers do either, and I've chatted to Jonathan.
Or the Confederation, I'm puzzled by all these bodies. May I just bring Jonathan back for a moment, because I think you do have a bit more belief that changing the system, that introducing an insurance element might help. Is that true?
Yes.
And if so, why?
Well, I think my wife used to be a GP, and I saw the ridiculous calls she got in the middle of the night, you know, people calling just to try and get a free bottle of Calpol and getting a GP out of bed for ridiculous reasons. And it's the same, I think, for hospital care. You have to pay, most people have to pay to see a dentist to a certain extent. Why not have to pay for hospital care?
I want to say on behalf of viewers and listeners, because this is what I felt. I thought, but this is out of date, because maybe people were calling their GPs in the middle of the night at one time, but now you're making a booking to see a GP maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time over a video link.
Yes, and now what you do is go to A&E
to
get the free bottle of Calpol.
Yes,
instead.
But you still think that introducing some sort of pay barrier might introduce more discipline into the relationship between the patient and the doctors?
I think it would help, but I think the main thing is we've got to have a better system of preventing people getting sick in the first place.
Jonathan and Myron, it's been fabulous to have you both back. and I hope this won't be the last time. I know it's always very short when you come on, but it would be terrific if you came back on another occasion. Stephen Dorrell, Professor J. Myron Thomas and Professor Jonathan Beard. Coming up, with ongoing shortages and new technology teething problems, are we in for a repeat of last year's summer of travel chaos? That's after the break.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes. Already to bless.
Yeah. Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind, and we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you. Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236. And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back. After nearly 3 years of travel frustration, starting with the pandemic, the travel industry was hoping that millions of its customers would enjoy a much easier summer. But Ryanair boss Michael O'Leary has called 2023 a watershed year as the industry tries to complete its recovery, despite the Ukraine war, industrial action, staff shortages, and process changes introduced by the European Union. Will we sadly endure another summer of chaos? The travel industry was one of the sectors badly hit by the pandemic and knock-on effects. So are we going to see a second summer of chaos? In a moment, we'll talk to travel expert Paul Charles. But first, let's cross to GB News' Will Hollis, who's at East Midlands Airport. Hello, Will. What is the expectation there? Is it that there's going to be another tricky summer?
Good morning. Yes, well, everybody that I've spoken to here at East Midlands Airport, or while looking into this story over the last couple of days, seems to be, just like you said, really optimistic. The travel industry wants to make this the year where it bounces back, and the idea of having another year or another couple of months of difficulty is something that they really don't want, ultimately, because it will turn people away from booking holidays in the future, and because it will cost them lots of money. Now, here at East Midlands Airport, it is, of course, a little bit quieter because it's still the winter months and summer might seem a little bit further away, but it doesn't take much to conjure up those images of travel chaos. We saw it all over the news, particularly at those bigger airports like Birmingham, London, Heathrow, and Manchester, where there was huge queues often outside of the airport terminal, or videos of people on social media where they were sitting down on their plane ready to fly off, only to be told that their flight had been cancelled. Now, that's the kind of image that the airline industry wants to avoid, and across the sector as a whole, there are thousands of jobs that need to be filled. And yesterday I was led into East Midlands Airport, where they had a jobs fair and they had 100+ jobs just working in this airport alone. And there was lots of young people considering their first careers, but also a lot of people that were considering segueing out of one line of work and getting into the travel industry. Now, the tricky thing is, while there's lots of jobs, if those jobs aren't filled, it might mean that travel chaos resumes again in the summer months. Now, that's just one problem. Retainment and recruitment is the big issue that the travel industry needs to avoid if they're going to get away from a repeat of travel chaos. But the other big one is, of course, border force strikes. We've seen border force strikes over the last few months, particularly at big entrances into the UK, like Calais and Dover, but also at airports as well. And the other one is EU checks, because, of course, being outside of the European Union, it makes it a little bit more difficult to get into European countries, whether you're going there to see family or if you're going on a foreign holiday. Now, we're waiting on something called the entry-exit system, and that's going to make it a little bit quicker. It's going to make biometrics a part of scanning your way in and out of a European country, but that's been delayed until at least the end of 2023. So there are certainly some big challenges for the entire industry, and if those challenges aren't overcome in the next few months, then we could see a repeat of the travel chaos that plagued last year.
That's not good. Thank you, Will. I'm going to turn to Paul Charles in the studio now. Paul, good morning to you. Let's get this point right about the European Union. This is a thing now that people are blaming on Brexit. But Britain was never in Schengen, never wanted to be in Schengen, which is the arrangement of passportless travel within the European Union. And the measures that are being applied are for non-Schengen countries, aren't they? I'm just thinking that actually blaming this on Brexit cannot be correct.
Yes, I think in particular this case is not pure Brexit. There are others which we can talk about, namely staffing issues, as Will mentioned. But undoubtedly this is going to affect several countries. If you're coming from the US, for example, into the EU, you will have to apply for this visa. And in a way, it's no different to what the US has done to us and to Europe. At the moment, if I want to go to the US, I have to apply for an ESTA. I have to get that visa. I can do it online for about £15. It's not overly expensive. So the EU is putting in place a similar measure.
From when?
From, at the moment, the latest date we have is November. It may slip again. They're having issues putting in the technology, making sure it works effectively, so it could well slip into 24, but at the moment, November.
And a single accreditation for all of the European Union. Any idea how long its validity would be? An ESTA for the US is 2 years.
Correct, and similar. So the EU is applying the same. It says it should be 2 years.
Quite a nice way of getting money out of it, isn't it?
Well, it is. And where's that money going to go? That's the big question. Will it go on better infrastructure to prevent us having to queue for so long? At the moment, many British holidaymakers are seeing long queues when they arrive in European countries because they're having to be manually processed, the passport's having to be stamped. It adds an extra 30 seconds to each manual processing.
Whereas European Union passengers coming into British airports, I've noticed, go through our e-gates.
Yes, they can. In most cases, there are some instances where they have to go through manual processing as well. But a lot of EU citizens actually don't have a passport. They have an identity card that they can use across the EU, so they have to apply for a passport to come into the UK.
And what about biometrics? And what do biometrics mean? Do they mean fingerprints or something else?
Well, all of us in the travel sector want a more seamless way of travelling. We see it in countries abroad, especially the Middle East, who have very effective biometrics, where you can even have your eyes shown to a camera and you'll be passed through without having to show your passport. We're seeing more of that come into the UK as well as the EU. Biometrics generally are a good thing. They speed up the processing time. It does, of course, mean your fingerprints will lie on some database somewhere in Europe, where previously they may not have been, but it seems to work pretty well with the US, and I'm sure the same will apply in the EU.
But let's say it's pupil recognition or fingerprints, either one. So that is relating you to an application that you've made, relating you to a document that you've obtained in some way.
It's used for two reasons. One, it could be you've applied online for a visa or an entry permit of some kind to the country you're going to, and they're matching the two up. But secondly, they're keeping your details on file and building up a very useful picture of who is entering the country and why and for how long. The beauty of it, and it's already being used in airports like Dubai in the Middle East, is that you can actually use those biometrics to help tell you to a message to your mobile phone when to go to the gate. And that sort of thing is very useful because it means you're more likely to catch your plane and not miss it.
Will, still there, I hope, at East Midlands Airport. You gave us a somewhat nuanced report a moment ago. If you were a betting man, do you think we're going to see scenes comparable with last summer? Yes or no?
Well, I think the airline industry thinks that the problems, particularly with short staffing, will peak in summer, but some of them say that it could go as far as Christmas. But I think most people are optimistic that we won't have those same problems.
Right. I'm not sure I heard a yes or a no there, but...
I don't think there will be the problems. I think there'll be more staff in place. The sector is under more pressure. They're charging more per ticket because of higher inflation. They have more money to invest at airports in making sure there's a smoother summer. So fingers crossed.
I think we should end on that more cheerful note. Thanks to Paul Charles and Will Hollis. Coming up, the aristocracy of the music world will gather tonight in Los Angeles for the 88th Grammy Awards. The nominations include Beyoncé, Adele, Harry Styles and Doja Cat, and a British classical vocal group, coming up after the break.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV
Surprised
with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
already to bless.
Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Rishi Sunak has been warned that unauthorised migrants crossing the Channel this year could be up by a half on 2022, reaching 65,000. Since his legislative solution to that is likely to take him to the edge of international law or beyond, he is warning that Britain might withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. Illegal migration is considered one of the greatest threats to support for the government. My next guest argues that humans are a naturally migratory species and the urge to move countries and resettle is normal human behaviour. He concludes that after setting out the history of centuries of large-scale movements in his new book, Migrants, the Story of Us All. Sam Miller joins me now. Well, Sam, congratulations on a book of major scholarship charting centuries of movement. But in the end, I was left asking myself, because I did read the book quite carefully, why did you write it? There was a hint at one point that you were trying to put right our amnesia. Explain what you meant by that.
I think there is a modern amnesia about migration. It's different in different countries, but it's an amnesia in which we behave as though we're naturally settled in one place, when actually the story of the human species is one of migration. More so than any other land mammal, we reached every part of the globe. Before we had planes and trains and all of that, we walked, we used rafts, and we reached almost everywhere. There's no other species, possibly the rat who was following us, that came close to that.
Fair enough. But at some points you seem to be disparaging of people who stay in one place, talking about sedentarism. Mm-hmm. But I would argue that the human race had to become sedentary because being nomadic, there weren't enough nuts and animals that we could kill to go around. So we settled and we farmed. So actually this was a progress. Becoming sedentary was a progress. And it's not something to be sneered at. It is what's made possible the increase in the global population and its prosperity.
Yeah, no, and if I give the impression of that I've disparaged sedentarism, that's entirely wrong. All I'm saying is it's relatively new in the story of the human race, that people talk about even 300 or 400 years ago, about half the world was on the move, was nomadic, in the old-fashioned sense of that word. In terms of deep history, agriculture is only 10,000, 12,000 years old. And the fact remains that ever since we have been moving, often moving to new lands to farm. If you think about the European migration to North America, to South America, that is largely a movement where people went to farm lands that hadn't been farmed before and where nomadic people or settled people lived prior to that.
I mean, I assume that your book is meant to be, as it were, pro-migration. But some of the migrations you record have, of course, been catastrophic for the indigenous receiving population. So Europeans going to North and South America, Europeans going to New Zealand, going to Australia, and even, I might say, in the view of Palestinians, the movement of Jewish people to Palestine to set up the State of Israel is regarded as a catastrophe. What is it then about migration that you want to commend to us?
I want us to remind ourselves in all of the arguments, the often very toxic arguments that we have about migration, one, that we're all descended from migrants, all of us, some very recently, some in a slightly more distant past. Two, that migration is normal. That doesn't make it right or wrong, but it's a thing that we've always done and are continuing to do it. And people who go about saying, oh, we can just stop it, just aren't being realistic most of the time. There are countries that have successfully stopped inward migration, but they do it at great cost to themselves, usually. North Korea, for instance, there aren't many people trying to get into North Korea at the moment.
You go quite far in your book. At one moment, for example, you say, how can we say to a person from Africa, you shall not come to Europe, given our history of colonisation and indeed of enslavement? I mean, are you serious? No politician trying to manage the policies of this country or any other can say, well, look, I can't deny entry to an African because I feel guilty about slavery, even if we should and do feel guilty about slavery.
No, I'm not saying they should be allowed in. I think it is part of the story that we have to recognise. And anyone who pretends that we can just draw a line over even the quite recent past just isn't realistic. It's part of the way this world is structured, and that a lot of Africans, a lot of Asians, a lot of people from the Caribbean have memories of those times. And if we disparage those memories or pretend that they're not worthwhile or not worthy of interest or as part of the debate, then we're in trouble, I think.
At another moment, you talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who deplored the moment when a man, presumably it was a man rather than a woman, first declared, "This is my private property," and put down a boundary. But again, you're not being serious, are you? You're not really against private property. I would even challenge you to imagine a world without frontiers. Is that possible?
So, on the question of property, I think what's important is we imagine, we try and work out, and there have been some recent very interesting studies about it. Look back at that bit of property you own, you personally, how did it come to be in someone's possession in the first place? And the asking of that question doesn't mean you have to return it to some mythical, imagined original owner, but it does create, I think, a bit of humility about the fact that you own this land and someone else doesn't, and someone else once used it for other purposes.
We are very lucky, I would say. We're very lucky to be British. We're very lucky to be born. I was born in the late 20th century, etc., etc., etc. And there are lots of unfortunate people who didn't have that luck, and they might say that they have the same human right to live here. But being practical for a moment, and if you would very briefly, because we're just coming to an end, what does your book say to the people who are worried about the schools and the health services, let's say in Kent, which are coming under pressure from Albanians arriving on boats on the shores?
That we've got to have realistic migration policies. By not having realistic, by just trying to keep everyone out, what we get, the people who come in then are mainly young men who are willing to take what seem to most of us like ludicrous risks, who are persuasive. Some of them need to be very good at lying to get in. Those are the migrants we are choosing at the moment, because of our lack of policies on migration, to have coming here. Actually, for various economic reasons, for other historical reasons, there are lots of other possible migrants who we might be welcoming here.
Thank you very much for that very succinct last answer. So the book is called Migrants, the Story of Us All. Many thanks to Sam Miller. Coming up, it's one of the most prestigious nights in the music business. From around midnight UK time tonight, some of the biggest and most famous celebrities from the music world will walk the red carpet at the 2023 annual Grammy Awards in Los Angeles. There are 91 categories, with pop stars, rappers and rock bands all vying to win a Grammy. As well as the music of Beyoncé, Harry Styles and Adele, classical music will be honoured. Friend of this programme and classical music legend Julian Lloyd-Webber went to meet one of the British nominees.
The annual Grammy Awards are the Oscars of the recording industry. This year's nominees include ABBA, Adele, Beyoncé, and that's just the A to Bs. So the Grammys are usually associated with pop and rock music, but this year 8 proud British voices are also nominated. I'm at their base at St Anne's and St Agnes near St Paul's, so let's go meet Voces 8. So, I'm with 2 of the longest-serving members of the group, Andrea and Barnaby. So, Barnaby, you set it all up, didn't you?
Yes, over 17 years ago now. We've come quite a long way since then.
It's been an incredible success story. How did it all start, and what was the sort of inspiration behind it?
Originally, we were all friends.
Yeah.
If you'd asked us if this was where we were meant to be today, we'd have said no. It was a hobby to begin with, and we were very fortunate in the early years. 2 things. We won a couple of competitions, which was important for our progress, but also the guys who we founded the group with really committed to the ensemble in those early years, which meant we were able to get it off the ground.
Fantastic, but have you managed to keep a lot of the same singers together?
Some of them. So I'm the only one still singing in the group. Andrew's been in almost that long, but a lot of the guys who've left are still involved with the foundation. We're a wider foundation. We do a lot of music education.
So you're touring so much.
We do.
Concerts, it must be quite difficult.
It's a commitment.
Yeah.
It's a real commitment, and we often refer to it as being a bit more like a lifestyle choice rather than just a job.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's like being in an orchestra, really. The amount of travelling, it's definitely a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, we get to know each other very well. It's
Yes.
like brother and sister here.
Yeah. Combination with Christopher Tin come up and the Grammys and the whole thing?
Well, he came to us, I'm very pleased to say. It's a pretty nice day when a composer of his stature knocks on the door and says, I've got this idea for a piece. It's 45 minutes long and I'd like to write it for you and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And so we said, thanks very much, we'd love to be involved.
It was actually during lockdown, wasn't it?
It was. So we had projects on the go, but it was very nice to have some real time to sit down and work on it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. It's called The Lost Birds.
Yes.
And it has a subtitle,
Extinction Elegy.
But in many ways, there's a lot of hope in it, isn't there?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the point. I mean, it's a celebration in some ways, but also a reflection on the extinction of several species of different birds, but how it reflects on us as humans, how we've been responsible for some of that, but also how it might reflect on our own future in the world, and the fact this hope comes from the fact that we can do something about it still now.
My favourite track is called The Thing.
Hope is the Thing
with Feathers,
yeah.
which is a lovely title, and it's very optimistic.
It is, and it's got that theme that runs through the whole piece as well. I think something that makes the work so brilliant is just the way it's conceived, not just in terms of its narrative, but in terms of its musical
And you
narrative
had a lot
also.
of input, didn't you, from the beginning?
We did, yeah. It's unusual for us that the composer doesn't just come and present the score, but Christopher actually came over to London 6 months in advance of the sessions with a whole set of sketches.
Brilliant.
And we just sat here for a day and recorded all of them, and then he went back and was able to work with some of the others. May appear in a future project, who knows, but don't appear in this one.
Well, it certainly worked, and the very best of luck with these awards.
Thank you.
Gently, oh, go gently. Underneath the stars I'll meet you. Underneath the stars I'll greet you, and there beneath the stars I'll leave you before you go your free will. Go gently, go gently. Underneath the stars you met me. Underneath the stars you left me. I wonder if the stars regret me. At least you'll go free will. Go gently.
I know you're very concerned, as so many of us are, with music education. And how did you get involved with that? And can you tell us a bit about the work you're doing?
Of course. I mean, we ourselves are here because of the wonderful opportunities we had. We would love for music to be in every community. We'd love for music to be in the curriculum. isn't there so much science out there that tells us how good that is for all of us? And here, in the position that we now have, which is relatively visible, we want to try and make a difference, not just championing the message, but actually getting out there and
And
doing
you've
the work.
started some sort of all kinds of courses and online activities.
Yeah, we have a big variety of stuff going on, from us physically being in communities and in schools and colleges, universities, running masterclasses, workshops for all ages. We also have a summer school that we run every year, and a whole team of people outside of just us in Watches 8, a whole education team within the foundation who are out across the world giving this material.
So you're touring all the time. Anything coming up in the UK?
Yeah, we have concerts here, there and everywhere, probably through the spring and early summer. Details are always on our website at watches8.com.
Excellent.
And I think in a couple of days' time we're jetting off to America for a month as well, so that's exciting.
Underneath the stars you left me, I wonder if the stars regret me. I'm sure they'd like me if they only met me. They come and go of their own free will. Go gently, gently, go gently, gently, go gently.
What beautiful voices, what superb harmony. Thanks to Julian Lloyd-Webber and Watches 8, and good luck to Watches 8 tonight at the Grammys. Well, coming up, there's going to be more Sunday conversation, including the record profits made by energy companies, and we'll be celebrating the history of the roller coaster. That will all be after the weather.
Hello again. Looking ahead, and there will be some wet and at times windy weather across northern parts, but further south it's going to stay drier and brighter, but with the risk of some frost and fog by night. Taking a look at the bigger picture, and you can see this weather front waiting out in the Atlantic. This is going to push towards the UK as we go through the next 24 hours or so, but at the moment we have this whacking great big area of high pressure across us, and that's why it's been such a settled day for most. Staying fine across much of England and Wales as we go through this evening, and with some clear skies through much of the night too, but a much cloudier picture across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, some blustery gusty winds and also a few spots of drizzly rain too. As a result of the cloud, it's going to stay quite mild here, but with the clear skies for England and Wales, turning cold with -4, -5 possible, so a fairly widespread frost and some freezing fog patches to watch out for first thing on Monday morning. Through Monday itself then, a bright start for much of England and Wales, but that thicker cloud towards the northwest is gradually going to encroach its way in, so many places turning a little bit cloudier, but I think it will stay sunnier towards the southeast, and here temperatures doing similar to today really, so highs of 9, possibly 10 Celsius. Also could get into double figures across the far north of Scotland because of that southerly wind. We could see some breaks across northern Scotland, but most places here staying quite cloudy. Through the end of the day on Monday, that weather front I mentioned earlier is going to push its way in, so a spell of more persistent rain and some strong winds reaching the far northwest of Scotland as we go through the night. Cloud keeping things quite mild here, but across England and Wales, again where we have the clear skies, it's once more likely to be a pretty chilly and frosty night. Again, temperatures getting to lows of -4, -5 perhaps, and again some freezing fog to watch out for as we go through Tuesday morning itself. Now taking a look as we go through the rest of this week, and it is going to stay quite changeable at times across northern parts, so some further rain to come, and it will be a bit windy too, but always dry and brighter towards the south, but here there is the risk of some frost and fog. Bye-bye.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio,
with the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Good afternoon and welcome to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo, bringing you good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. Coming up, energy giant Shell has been under fire this week for making an annual global profit of £32.2 billion, the highest in its history. Should oil companies be squeezed till the pips squeak, or will that nearly squeeze them out of investing in Britain? Staying with energy, has the government any idea how it will achieve net zero policy and at what cost? We'll study the history of the roller coaster with all its ups and downs, and I'll get a taste of one of the plummiest jobs in the world, being a restaurant critic. All that and more after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you. It's 1 minute past 12. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Liz Truss claims she wasn't given a realistic chance to act on her policies when she was in office. That's in her first major comments on her premiership since leaving Number 10. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, the former Prime Minister says she wasn't blameless in what happened, but criticised a lack of political support. She said she stands by her low-tax agenda, calling it a break from leftward thinking within the party. Ms Truss resigned after 49 days following economic turmoil caused by her mini-budget. Earlier today on GB News, Business Secretary Grant Shapps defended the government's economic plans.
I think that Liz's instincts are very conservative in the sense that we want to see taxes, lowered over a period of time. But I think everyone recognises we've been through, hell with coronavirus, which added, £400 billion at least of expenditure. We then had a war in Ukraine, which has pushed up energy prices and inflation and been very, very costly.
Police say a key witness in the search for missing mother of two, Nicola Billy, has now come forward. Officers appealed for a woman seen on CCTV wearing a yellow coat and pushing a pram in the area where the dog walker disappeared in Lancashire last Friday. They've called the speculation and abuse on social media towards the witness totally unacceptable. Forensic search and rescue specialist Peter Faulding told GB News he thinks the police need to explore all angles of where Nicola could be and not just focus on the river.
We'll be looking into many other things. They'll be looking at other people within the family. They'll be looking at people who live locally, whether there's any sex attackers who live locally and things like this. I mean, we don't know. Nicola can be kidnapped and being held somewhere against her will. She might still, hopefully, she'll still be alive. She may have just wandered off. Just with a mobile phone by a river, that's not good enough evidence for me. This needs a lot, we need to clear that river and then that can be ruled out.
The Nurses' Union has called on the Prime Minister to make a new pay offer in order to avoid next week's planned strikes. The head of the Royal College of Nursing, Pat Cullen, says a meaningful offer could avert the action. The NHS is facing what many are calling the biggest strike day the NHS has ever seen, as tens of thousands of nurses and ambulance staff in England are set to walk out tomorrow and Tuesday. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called the action regrettable, saying it will undoubtedly have an impact on patients. China says it strongly opposes the decision by the US to shoot down a suspected spy balloon, which was thought to be carrying out surveillance of sensitive military sites. Fighter jets brought it down over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South Carolina yesterday. 3 airports were closed and airspace restricted in the southeast of the country after President Joe Biden vowed to take care of it. China, though, maintains it was a weather airship which had blown off course. A series of missile strikes by Russia have seriously damaged a university and a residential building in central Kharkiv. The blast on the Ukrainian city injured at least 3 people. However, British defence analysts say Moscow has made small advances in its attempt to encircle the city of Bakhmut, which has been the focus of Russian forces for weeks. It follows Ukraine's president saying the situation on the front lines in the east was getting tougher, with Russia adding more and more troops into battle. And Pakistan's former President General Pervez Musharraf has died at the age of 79 following a prolonged illness. He died in hospital in Dubai, having been in a self-imposed exile since 2008. Musharraf, who seized power in a coup in 1999, oversaw rapid economic growth in the country. He survived several assassination attempts, including from Al-Qaeda and other militant Islamist groups. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Sunday with Michael Portillo.
Thanks, Tatiana. The outrage was predictable as the energy giant Shell reported its highest annual profits in its 115-year history. Calls have been renewed for a more enforceable and higher level of windfall tax. Opposition parties said that Shell's profits were outrageous. Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused a surge in oil and gas prices, which has contributed hugely to the record profits. Last year, the British government introduced a windfall tax called the Energy Profits Levy on the extraordinary earnings of firms to help it reduce our gas and electricity bills. Oil companies may pay less where they incur decommissioning costs or where they invest in new UK energy projects. Shell has said that it will pay $134 million in UK windfall tax for 2022 and expects to pay more than $500 million in 2023. Sir Vince Cable was chief economist for Royal Dutch Shell in the 1990s, Secretary of State for Business in the coalition government, and leader of the Liberal Democrats between 2017 and 2019, which gives you a series of different perspectives, and welcome very much to the programme. In short, do you favour, in view of these very high profits, increasing the windfall tax?
Yeah, I think a system of windfall taxes, which taxes energy companies particularly high in a boom period and relatively low in a depressed period, because they're very cyclical, makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I don't agree with is basically scapegoating Western energy companies because of the wider concerns about the environment. But I happen to believe very strongly that we've got to address climate change. I believe in zero carbon objectives. But you know, the old companies are actually simply producing what we choose to consume as motorists or for our domestic heating. And if it wasn't produced by Shell and BP and Exxon, for that matter, it would be produced by Saudi Aramco or Gazprom, or the less wholesome producers of hydrocarbons.
I hope we might be able to see a graph which will show us the profitability of the oil companies from 2018 up to the present day. And what that shows is obviously that profits at the moment are very, very high. They have actually been negative in recent years, and they've been low for a number of years. So your idea of a windfall tax would be reflective of this. I mean, does that mean we would be paying oil companies money in the years when they made losses?
Well, they would offset some of their costs. I mean, that's essentially the way the North Sea oil regime operated. We've kept tweaking the system. That's basically the principle. And I think it's important to see it in a global sense. I mean, Shell were making, I think, 40 billion globally, but they were paying 14 billion in taxes in different regimes in the country. I mean, it may not have gone to the British Treasury, and that may be because British governments haven't designed the British system very well. I don't know, but a lot of it's gone to Canada, Australia, Nigeria, other countries where they're very active in exploration.
Yes, I think a lot of people do not recall or don't understand that it's only quite a small minority of that profit which has been generated from United Kingdom activities.
It's about 1 in 20, I think.
Yeah, let's say something like 2 billion. Yes, 1 in 20, that'd be the same, wouldn't it? That's about 2 billion. And they're saying that they're going to be paying 500 million on the windfall tax, that's dollars, in the coming year. But you have a feeling that it ought to be more. I mean, how do you, since the windfall tax has been designed to fall upon them when they make these extraordinary profits, why do you have a feeling that we need to go another stage?
Well, they already have gone another stage. I think there is a levy, there's a windfall levy that has gone up in the last year, and that seems probably a proportionate response. I think what will be significant will be how we respond when the price crashes, as it almost certainly will. And I think that exposes, in a way, the ambiguous approach we have to the energy companies. Do we want them to produce more, or do we want them to produce less hydrocarbons? I mean, there is this view that they should simply stop and produce renewable energy. I mean, they are actually moving in that direction. I mean, Shell, I think, have one of the biggest offshore wind farms, the London Array, and they are moving in a direction. But, their technology background isn't in renewable energy, and it might be more sensible for money to go back to shareholders who then invest it in renewable companies. So I think, there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion about what we want these big energy companies to do.
But if you were still business secretary, I assume that you'd be quite wary. You'd be talking to the Chancellor about whether our tax regime was competitive with other tax regimes. You'd want to make sure that we were getting our fair share, but you also wouldn't want to drive investment away from Britain.
Yes, indeed I did so. I mean, I did exactly that, but at the same time was also arguing that these companies should be contributing more to the British supply chain. I mean, I think the time I actually got cross with Shell as a minister was when I discovered that almost all of their big offshore development were being outsourced to manufacturing companies overseas. They could have been done at Hull or whatever. So, the British government has a role in developing an industrial strategy around our oil companies, which I think we should see it in that much bigger sense, and actually giving them incentives to move more actively into renewables.
But I'm thinking that for some politicians, obviously on the opposition benches more than the government bench, it's very easy to say we ought to get more money out of the oil companies because they don't have to have the responsibility of considering whether the tax rate may drive investment away from Britain.
Indeed. I mean, you can understand it from their point of view. They're representing British voters. They're not representing the world. But no, I think if you're thinking of it rationally, you have to make up your mind, what do we want these companies to do? Do we want them to go somewhere else? And they are doing, in fact. I mean, as I say, the fact
What, because you think we may have over-egged it?
I think there was a tipping point about a year ago when the campaign was rather shrill. They were shifting the balance of their investment somewhere else, but then it was partly corrected by allowing offsets against future development in the UK. But I think there's a confusion in the British government and British politics generally. Is there an energy security issue here? Do we want to have these companies investing in the UK for oil and gas or renewables, or do we just want them to fade away?
I, like you, have worked in the oil sector, and I'm rather frustrated by the hysteria that accompanies campaigns. I'm also a great fan of the arts, and various arts organisations have sent BP, for example, packing, because they don't want to be associated with oil anymore. I mean, I think, I remember the fantastic achievements of the oil and gas industry in the North Sea, engineering feats that were thought to be close to impossible, which were achieved by engineers working in Britain, and many of them were British engineers. Isn't it rather odd the way we tip between, having heroes and then tearing them down? We're iconoclasts in that respect.
Well, I think your point about the arts is absolutely right. I mean, I wouldn't object to going to the National Gallery because BP have supported it. I mean, clearly they're trying to buy good reputation, but all companies do that. Nothing wrong with it. Having been inside Shell and its planning system, I mean, I think one thing the public probably don't appreciate, that long before the British government, long before the Greenpeace and other campaigning groups, Shell and other companies were thinking about the problems of climate change and how they were going to have to adapt to it. I think one of my first tasks as chief economist was going to explain to the British government and the European Commission what a carbon tax would look like, but they weren't interested. I mean, it hadn't yet then become a problem for them. So Shell just got on with its traditional business because they weren't under pressure to do anywhere else. But they were doing forward thinking, and the whole shift from heavy oils to gas, and which is what Shell pioneered. And of course, gas has 60% of the carbon of a heavy oil fraction. It was a big strategic shift designed to anticipate the problem of global warming, and this was 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And we, a more balanced view of the energy sector, I think, is merited.
May we take for a moment a balanced view of Liz Truss? You're an economist. We heard an economist this morning saying that Liz Truss had some good points about stimulating growth. Did you have any sympathy with the idea that we needed to cut taxes to stimulate growth?
Well, it depends on what tax is. I mean, I was in the coalition government, and one of the big things we did, which got very little credit for, certainly the Lib Dems, was the cutting of tax on low earners, where, you know, income tax is a particularly problem, especially when you combine it with the tapering of benefits. And there clearly is an incentive problem if you're a low-paid worker and you're effectively paying tax of 70, 80, 90%, which many of them are. So there is a growth issue in certain forms of taxation, and you could add corporation tax to that. So a targeted approach to taxation which reflects the incentives and the importance of growth is merited. But I don't have much sympathy with Liz Truss, I have to say. I mean, she's using this language about right wing and left wing, but actually in some ways embracing the economics of the far left, the idea that you should reject markets and that deficits can be covered by magical economics, and it makes absolutely no sense. And she made a terrible mess.
But some people would be puzzled by the sentence, if you cut taxes, the income from taxes will go up, the take from taxes will go up. Do you dispute that that can happen sometimes? You can sometimes cut tax rates and get more revenue.
It can, and you know, the infamous Laffer curve, which Professor Laffer drew on his napkin for President Reagan. Yeah, I mean, it has been demonstrated when you have penal rates of tax, it can actually raise less revenue than having lower rates, but it's only on certain taxes at certain bands of taxation. Yeah, we shouldn't be irrational about it. You can have negative effects, but I think she has taken that rather exceptional set of circumstances and built it up into a global philosophy, which is absolute nonsense.
Yeah. I noticed as she was withdrawing her taxes, when she had to concede on the corporation tax, she stood, I think, in front of Downing Street and said, this is going to raise more tax. And I thought, but wait a minute, I thought you told me that cutting the tax rates was going to increase the revenue. So she was sort of contradicting herself. Lovely to see you, Vince. Thank you very much. Sir Vince Cable. Coming up, is the government's legal commitment to achieve net zero by 2050 disastrous for Britain and great for China? That's after the break.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you. Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. The United Kingdom government has an ambitious target to tackle climate change. It has committed Britain by law to reduce the country's greenhouse gases to net zero by 2050. As a new book reminds us, the government has never set out how it will achieve that target and is relying on the rapid development of technologies that are untested or not yet invented. Ross Clark is a leader writer and columnist for both The Spectator and The Daily Telegraph, and he argues that it will cost billions of pounds, cause intense economic hardship for millions, and disadvantage Britain. His book is called Not Zero: How an Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Won't Even Save the Planet. Now, what is your thesis? Let's see whether we can get it out in the next few minutes. First of all, tell me about the failure to plan for how this target is going to be achieved.
I mean, first I'd say that I have no argument with the general direction of policy towards clean energy and cutting carbon emissions. But what the problem is the legally binding target to reach net zero by 2050. And the government has no credible plan to get there. It had no credible plan in 2019, when this was nodded through the House of Commons without even a vote. It still has no credible plan. It has no idea how much it will cost. The Treasury was asked to come up with an estimate. It couldn't do so. It said there's too many unknowables. That requires technologies which haven't been invented, haven't been scaled up, and so on. It's very easy to get sort of fixated on things like electric cars and wind turbines and so on. But, I mean, take an electric car, lots of problems with them, charging, their cost and so on. But say you can overcome those and we're all driving electric cars by 2040. That doesn't get you to net zero or anything like net zero, because a lot of the emissions are tied up with the manufacture of the vehicle, the steel, the plastics and the batteries, particularly the batteries. An electric car, making it involves half as many carbon emissions again as as a petrol or diesel car. And I mean, you get to a situation. How are we going to decarbonise steel? How are we going to decarbonise plastic? You have to drive on roads. How are we going to decarbonise cement making, which is one of the big emitters in the world? Tarmac, bitumen, comes out of oil wells. And these are all these other sort of peripheral issues. Well, not peripheral, they are very central issues, and which the government has not even begun to grapple with.
And you make the point that the way we are doing the counting is that we're counting emissions that are created within the country. So if we decide to import emissions that have been created elsewhere, we don't count those in our target. Is that right?
This is one of the very big problems of it, is that the target is purely set on what are called territorial emissions, carbon emissions physically spewed out within Britain. It excludes aviation, excludes shipping, but even more importantly, it includes emissions elsewhere in the world spewed out in the cause of making goods and food and so on for UK consumers. What this means is that the government has given itself this very, very big perverse incentive to export out industry so it can export the carbon emissions with it, export our food production because it exports the carbon emissions. They go on some other countries' carbon balance sheet. And you see, the result is, a country like China, which has a net zero target but not a legally binding one, and has made it quite clear that it's not going to get there at the expense of its economic growth, it gives China a huge advantage. And, a hard example, the German chemicals giant BASF at the end of last year announced it's not going to do any more expansion in Europe because of high energy prices. Where is it going? It's building a £10 billion plant in China. And there is so much of our industry, the remaining industry will be sent offshore by this target, and also our food production. You rewild 100 acres of land, you grow a few trees, say, well, they'll suck a bit of carbon out of the air, and you send the agriculture abroad. Well, that doesn't help the planet. All it does is help another country's agriculture business. So we import it instead.
That's a very important part of your thesis in your book, that despite all these efforts, which may impoverish us in all sorts of ways, we'll come back to that in a moment, it doesn't actually help the planet because stuff is still going on elsewhere. Emissions are being created elsewhere. And Britain is quite a minor contributor to global emissions.
Britain accounts for about 1% of global emissions. All the countries which have committed themselves legally to a net zero target, that's mostly sort of Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Chile also, they account for about 10% of global emissions. The rest of the big emitters, China, no, they've set themselves a ambition, but not a legally binding target. Joe Biden, to some people he's a hero, climate hero, because he's not Donald Trump. But he hasn't tied America's hands behind its back with a net zero target. It's just said he'll, 50% by the 2030s. And what's he doing? Instead, his Inflation Reduction Act is really, it's a piece of protectionism in disguise. Huge bungs to consumers who buy American-made electric cars and the like.
Tell us about some of the costs that ordinary people will face. I mean, for example, if we go ahead with getting rid of natural gas boilers.
Well, the suggested alternative to this is heat pumps, and that they work well in modern, well-insulated houses. They don't work so well in older houses, and there are 9 million properties in Britain which have solid walls which are not easy to insulate. You can do it, but it's a huge cost. It could cost £10,000 for your heat pump, another £10,000 to insulate your house. That's a huge bill to place on some of the poorest people. And, you think most taxes and so on, regressive taxation is seen as a very, very bad thing. You don't put the burden on the poor, you put it proportionally more on the rich. But when it comes to the climate, the rules seem to be reversed. And when it comes to the wealthy, we hand them great subsidies for buying electric cars or for installing biomass boilers and the like. And the costs are going to land disproportionately on the poor. Both whether they're buying a car or they're buying, they're insulating an old house, the costs are going to land more on the poor.
The really depressing thing for me as a former legislator is you said in passing there that this went through in 2019 without a vote.
Without a vote in the Commons, yeah. It's unbelievable. And the country's attention at the time was on Brexit, and, few people even noticed that we were committing ourselves to this target. And it was put through, as an amendment to the existing Climate Change Act, which commit ourselves to 80% reduction. But to get from 80% to zero is a very, very big move, and it wasn't properly debated. The House of Lords did have a vote, and they put an amendment on the Act saying, well, where is the plan? How are you going to get there? And but they still nodded it through, and that's what was unbelievable. There's only one MP in the Commons asked, Graham Stringer, the Labour MP, one of the few MPs to have a scientific training, by the way. He said, well, where's the impact assessment? New laws, you should have an impact assessment. And the government said it's not necessary. for this huge commitment.
In the short term, some of the impacts are going to be that activists are going to be able to use the law to stop developments. For example, if we wanted to expand an airport, the activists will be there saying, well, this is inconsistent with the law. Would you guess that sooner or later this act is going to have to be revoked?
I think the closer we get to 2050, it will become more and more obvious that it's been a big mistake. And yes, it will almost certainly have to be revised. I mean, one of three things can happen. Firstly, all the miracle technology breakthroughs, we get to net zero. Secondly, the target is revised. But the outcome I really fear is that the government will try and fudge this, target, try and get there by exporting our industry, exporting food production, placing huge costs on the poor and on the rest of us, impoverishing us and, with a very negative effect on the economy and society.
So as far as you're concerned, the sooner that this is repealed, the better. Thanks to Ross Clark. Coming up, does it fill you with terror or excitement? The roller coaster is said to date back to the 17th century. About 125 years ago, roller coasters benefited from the invention of the loop. What makes the knuckles go white? Coming up after the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you. It's just coming up to 12:30. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Liz Truss claims she wasn't given a realistic chance to act on her policies when she was in office in her first major comments on her premiership since leaving Number 10. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, the former Prime Minister says she wasn't blameless in what happened, but criticised a lack of political support. Ms Truss resigned after 49 days following economic turmoil caused by her mini-budget. Earlier on GB News, Business Secretary Grant Shapps defended the government's economic plans.
I think that Liz's instincts are very conservative in the sense that we want to see taxes, lowered over a period of time. But I think everyone recognises we've been through, hell with coronavirus, which added, £400 billion at least of expenditure. We then had a war in Ukraine, which has pushed up energy prices and inflation and been very, very costly.
Police say a key witness in the search for missing mother of two, Nicola Bulley, has now come forward. Officers appealed for a woman seen on CCTV footage wearing a yellow coat and pushing a pram in the area where the dog walker disappeared in Lancashire last Friday. They've called the speculation and abuse on social media towards the witness totally unacceptable. The Nurses' Union has called on the Prime Minister to make a new pay offer in order to avoid next week's planned strikes. The head of the Royal College of Nursing, Pat Cullen, says a meaningful offer could avert the action. The NHS is facing what many are calling the biggest strike day the NHS has ever seen, as tens of thousands of nurses and ambulance staff in England are set to walk out tomorrow and Tuesday. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called the action regrettable, saying it will undoubtedly have an impact on patients. And a series of missile strikes by Russia on Ukraine have injured at least 3 people and seriously damaged a university and a residential building in central Kharkiv. However, British defence analysts say Moscow has made small advances in its attempt to encircle the city of Bakhmut, which has been the focus of Russian forces for weeks. It follows Ukraine's president saying the situation in the east was getting tougher, with Russia adding more troops into battle. TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thanks, Tatiana. 125 years ago, Ed Prescott patented the first loop-the-loop roller coaster at Coney Island in New York. Since then, the technology has advanced dramatically, finding new ways to terrify and amuse. The Smiler at Alton Towers holds the record for the most rotations, with 14 corkscrew loops on a single ride. The Formula Rossa ride at the Ferrari World theme park in the United Arab Emirates is the fastest in the world, reaching speeds of 240 kilometres per hour. daredevils just keep demanding more and more. Michelle Hicks is Managing Director and Andrew Porter is Creative Director at Firefly Creations, which designs and produces roller coasters and attractions. Michelle, you are an engineer.
Correct, yes.
May I ask you then, first of all, how on earth you got into engineering roller coasters?
Well, that is a very good question. And it all stems from an interest. You know, as a child and growing up, I love going to theme parks and I love going on roller coasters. So for me, I was always looking for a career that allowed me to go into designing roller coasters and other kinds of attractions. So I then studied civil engineering, which is a great foundation in order to allow me to then go into this industry and kind of apply those skills you would take traditionally doing a building or designing a foundation and then making that into roller coasters and other attractions.
Did you pass through being a railway engineer at one point? Were you doing railways?
Yes, I was working on railways, I was working on bridges and buildings, so we've been through all of those kind of categories of structures, which actually applies in the same way to roller coasters. So it's a really exciting way to take lots of new technologies as well and apply that into the design of roller coasters, which are, of course, structures as well.
Tell me about the shape of the loop, which was an important breakthrough. Because I never really noticed this, but the loop on a modern roller coaster is not circular, it's not round.
No, absolutely. So when you look at the very first roller coasters, they had a completely circular loop, but actually that was really quite uncomfortable because of the forces that places on you. So when you look at the modern roller coasters, they have what we call a clothoid loop, which is actually a teardrop shape. And what that means is as you go into the start of that loop, it's a much higher radius, and that reduces the forces acting on the rider, which actually is a good thing because it means we can go in much faster without having high forces that would be uncomfortable. So really the modern roller coaster has developed to allow us to go higher, to go faster and to add as much excitement as possible.
And when we are literally upside down, how is it that we don't fall out of the car?
Well, we have something called a centripetal force, which actually keeps riders within the car, so it pushes them back onto the seat as they go around the loop. But of course,
I don't want to tempt anyone, but if we didn't have the bar on at that moment, would we, in all probability at least, remain in our seat anyway because of the centripetal forces?
Correct. As long as the roller coaster's been designed correctly and those forces are strong enough, then you would stay as you're going through a loop. It's a little bit like when you have a bucket of water. If you kind of throw that around your head, it will stay in the bucket because of the same forces.
So the development of that shape of loop, give me the word again,
Clothoid.
Clothoid.
Yes.
The development of that was an important development.
Mm-hmm.
Were there other interesting stages in the history of the roller coaster that helped it to jump to the next stage?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look through the types of roller coasters that exist in the world, you've got everything from hundreds-year-old traditional wooden roller coasters through to the biggest, fastest, most modern roller coasters. Really what we're looking at is how does the technology of the day apply? And that's sort of over the last 100 years or more that these roller coasters have been developing. So now you've got launched roller coasters. So rather than going up a traditional lift hill like you would see on the older coasters, you can actually launch to speeds of, say, 150 miles an hour, like on Formula Rossa. You can do that just using magnets or using hydraulic propulsion systems. So really, as the technology is developed, we have new ways of thrilling people and exciting them when they're on these rides.
And has safety got better and better?
Absolutely. Safety is absolutely priority in everything we do in the design of rides. And of course, as the technology has increased, so is safety, and so are the systems that are in place to ensure these rides and attractions are continually safe for guests that use them.
Now, Andrew, if I've understood the division between you, you're thinking about new concepts all the time. Are they engineering concepts, or nowadays are they virtual reality concepts? Where are you? How do you spend most of your day?
I'm a storyteller. I tell stories. Yeah. I entertain people. I take hardware out there, roller coasters or dark rides on haunted houses, and we look to the market and say, what's exciting out there? What trends are out there? If we're getting teenagers coming to these parks, what do they want to spend their time? We make memories. We are memory makers, essentially, at the end of the day. And when you're there with your children or your friends and you're having a good time and you come off and you laugh, that's a positive thing that we're involved with. Now, that positive thing could be we're running away from a ghost, or we're getting in a Formula One car and we're driving at 1,000,000 miles an hour speeds through cities, over dams and bridges while explosions are going off around us. The modern day roller coaster, as you can see on the screen there, is changing into stories. I want to be James Bond in the car, driving through a city where explosions are going off. What Michelle has to do is take that creative brief from me and go, OK, what's the launch system? How do we make it safe? If we're putting fire next to this ride, how close can the audience be to that fire, and how do we extract it out of the building as well? So my background is more of an architectural background. I used to design shopping centres and retail, you know, to learn about disability laws and everything. And it didn't really excite me as much to say, how do we take an image that you can see there of this nightmare tree and have a black stallion running at 200 miles an hour around inversions and create this idea that I'm in a nightmare. So when children, adults and families come off, they don't say, that roller coaster was amazing. They say, we escaped the ghost. We rode on the back of a horse at 100 miles an hour. We flew to the moon and back. And new technologies with augmented reality, virtual reality, and LED technology you can see in Hollywood movie sets are now using stage sets of giant LED TVs instead of the traditional sets. We're using that technology now in our amusement parks and theme parks.
So when we go to amusement parks in the future, Andrew, they're not going to look the same. No. I mean, when I go to an amusement park now, I see the outline of the roller coaster. It's one of the things that tells me I've arrived. But we won't see that in the future?
No. We're trying to hide the tracks. We're trying to hide the physical aspect of something that takes you on the journey and then just show the car, the vehicle we're in. So there's now new technology coming out. Me and Michelle work in a lot of new technologies and fields. The ride vehicle you can see on the screen at the moment is brand new technology. It's kind of like your vacuum cleaner at home, and it can take you anywhere that you kind of sit on through different sets and through smoke and fog. We're looking at the new technology out there to immerse people in worlds, to get them out of their home, get them to a theme park with your family and have a real adventure that you can touch, feel, smell, and get a positive memory from it.
In a way, I'm not quite sure which tense we've been in, because what's the last thing that you actually developed, the last thing that was actually built? Describe that for me. Maybe Michelle.
Well, I think there's so many different kinds of attractions we work on. One of the examples you saw just on the screen just now was a new, completely autonomous vehicle, which has been announced. We announced at a trade show right towards the end of last year. And it's really exciting because what it allows us to do is not constrain to the tracks anymore. No longer do we have a route that we have to go along. We can go anywhere, we can change the route, we can change the story. So almost you can have multiple rides in one. So I think it really is changing the whole narrative of what we can do in these attractions. And that certainly excites us. And I think we're getting to a change where theme parks are going to develop as a result of that. And the fact that people want these new engaging stories. They don't just want to go higher and faster anymore. They really want to immerse themselves within that narrative. So that's what we're looking at technologies to achieve.
And picking up that point, Andrew, are you a bit of a psychologist? Have you looked into why it is we go to theme parks? You've used words like excitement and memory and so on.
That's right.
But you know, it seems rather counterintuitive that we like to be scared stiff.
I think when you look at the human race and how we've developed, the world has been made safe for us. It's been made safe. And I think there's still that element where people want to push the limits. They want to go to do something that's different, that excites them. And going on a roller coaster, when you've done the ride, certainly if you're scared to go on the roller coaster, I was when I was 14, I was terrified of them. I didn't want to go at all. And my friends forced me on Nemesis at Alton Towers when I was 14. And I remember vividly that experience. But when I exited the ride, my confidence was an all-time high. I had a passion that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And more importantly, I started to see people coming off the ride, smiling, laughing, hugging, and going, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe that we did this together. And those are really strong, important memories for the world, I think.
And I hope you're not going to put an upper age limit on your attractions.
Oh, absolutely not. There's a lady, 98 years old, that still rides the rides in Blackpool, and why shouldn't she?
I'll be there. Andrew Porter and Michelle Hicks, thank you very much indeed. Coming up, sausage and mash, fish and chips, apple crumble, sticky toffee pudding, all that with restaurant critic William Sitwell after the break.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you. Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back. It's a dream job, eating at the best restaurants, enjoying great food and drink, all in exchange for writing a few hundred words. What makes the food writer worth his salt? With many amateur critics on social media, do we still need the professional? I met up with food writer and restaurant critic for the Daily Telegraph, William Sitwell, at the Seckford pub in London's Clerkenwell. William, you come from a distinguished family of writers. Would I be right in thinking then that as you became a food writer, your first love was writing?
You don't become a food writer unless you can write in the first place. And when people ask me how do you become a food writer, I always say you've got to be a writer first. I'm very proud of my forebears, Edith, Osbert and Sir Chevreul, and the fact that they, rather rebelled against their aristocratic background. They picked up the pen rather than the shotgun.
So you have to be a writer. How much do you have to know about food?
I think it helps if you know a bit about it. But the most important thing is that ability to string a sentence together.
Yes.
That ability to balance information with colour. And then your knowledge of the subject.
Your knowledge of the subject, are you someone who enjoys cooking?
I enjoy cooking. I don't do it nearly enough. I'm a sort of classic man in that, I like to man the stove for Sunday lunch or dinner parties and, pull out the big guns and use the big equipment that I have and make a big splash and sort of do a big show-off meal. I mean, that's just so I don't cook as nearly as often as I should, and I don't shop for food as much as I should. But, I do love to cook, and I think having spent a lot of time in kitchens and watching chefs work, I like to think that I've learnt a few things along the way about, keeping your station tidy, having good order in terms of the way you cook and planning a little bit so they're sort of not too chaotic. There are some things I've learned watching the greatest chefs cook that I, try and employ at home, and I think organisation is probably one of those things.
And how have the nose and the palate come on?
Well, my wife would say that I've got a dreadful palate and I can't tell the difference between one spice and the next. But I'm someone who I suppose has just developed a palate from experience. So when you get presented with what the chef or the restaurant would have you believe is the classic example of something, and I know because I've eaten it in other places around the world and I've spoken to people who are perfectionists about that dish, I can probably bring that judgment to it.
A restaurant critic has to comment not only on food but also wine.
I think it's important not to sort of prattle on about it too much. I think if it's relevant, then you mention it. I've got a small knowledge that I'm constantly building on. A love of wine is an adventure that just never ends. I think it's certainly emblematic of a decent restaurant when you see a wine list that's sympathetic with the food, where the price is also kind of tolerable for the diner.
You enter a restaurant to do a review. Do they know you're coming? Do they know who you are and what you're doing there?
Do they know I'm coming? No, because I always book under an assumed name. It's a kind of slightly silly name, which I won't tell you about. So I book under an assumed name because I don't want the bells and whistles to be sort of coming out even before I've entered the place. If they know I'm there when I'm there, well, it depends on whether they know me. Some restaurants you can tell there's a sort of slight tremor when you walk in, which is quite amusing. Other restaurants have either pretend they don't know you or don't know you. So it depends upon the place. I don't want to sound too pompous, but there is a service to the public here in writing restaurant reviews, because I'm acutely aware of the cost and I don't want people to waste their money. So I think it's really important that you have a faithful experience.
When does your creative process begin in the restaurant? I mean, for example, if you walk into the 40 towers of restaurants, are you immediately composing your lampoon of the place?
My brief was very simple when the Telegraph employed me. That was to entertain. So yeah, one's looking around and trying to find things that are going to make for an interesting paragraph, but I'm not composing it as I'm sitting there. I don't take any notes. So I take a photograph of everything I've eaten and the place to sort of jog my memory. The review begins at home in front of my computer. The worst place is somewhere that's just a kind of like a sort of 3 out of 5 average, it's okay sort of place, because people really want to be told, is this fantastic or is it just so dire? And people love to read really terrible reviews, I'm afraid. If it's only about the food, then I think that you're missing a trick, because the whole point of dining is the conviviality, it's the conversation, it's the interaction between two people. And sure, the food's important, but it's one of so many different parts. And some of the greatest meals we've ever had are about the companionship, where you've forgotten about what you've eaten. And that's the restaurant still created that environment. It doesn't do the place a disservice to say, I can't remember what I ate.
Presumably, you would begin with some observations about how the food looked.
That's an attractive, generous plate, so no complaints, really. I think when you look at a plate of fish and chips, you're eager to see what the texture's like. Is the batter crisp?
My plate is generous too, very generous. Of course, underpinned by a mashed potato, but I've got a couple of particularly fat sausages there, haven't I? Do you ever have a conscience about your reviews? Has anyone ever written to you and said, your review really did us in?
There was a chef actually in London whose restaurant I didn't particularly like, who actually started threatening me. He sent me threatening emails, threatening texts, threatening voicemails, and I actually reported him to the police and wrote a piece about his threats. And he then took me to the Press Complaints Commission because I wrote a piece about the experience, and he said I'd portrayed him to be a sort of violent thug, but he lost his case because that's exactly what he was. So some people do react rather badly. I think that a sensible chef who gets a negative review can kind of curse amongst his friends and in the kitchen, and then sit back and think, well, maybe there was a few points that I can learn from. I don't do it lightly. I'm aware that my brief is to entertain, but I'm also aware of the fact that hospitality is struggling, has been struggling for the last few years, and a bad review can have a detrimental effect on the business. But I'm there to honestly, truthfully describe an experience and to save people from wasting money on a restaurant that's going to waste their money. These days, us critics have rather less power because there's so much noise out there on social media, TripAdvisor. I think the days of a critic shutting down a restaurant are gone now. But I also think that the strength of a positive review far outweighs the negative effect of a bad review.
What is the role, do you think, of the professional reviewer now? Will the professional reviewer survive?
The very fact that there is so much noise out there, I think, means that us professional critics, the critics aligned to specific newspapers, the kind of old school type critics, do have a place because we possibly can stand out against that noise. I think because there's so much noise and chatter, And because we do what we do, because we are professional, I think that our days are not quite numbered yet. It takes years to be able to write properly with experience, so I don't think we're quite finished yet.
This must be a big hazard of your work, having to eat puddings. How are you not the size of a house?
I think a combination of anxiety and my Peloton. And I don't always order pudding. I try and order things on a menu that I wouldn't be able to eat at home. Dishes that are more unusual, harder to cook.
If I may say, I have had the most perfect meal. That is to say, I've loved the setting. The food has been lovely. But most of all, I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Can I have a bit of your sticky toffee pudding?
Certainly. But a food review can be sharper than a steak knife. Thanks again to William Sitwell and to the Seckford Pub for hosting us with great food. Alistair Stewart is here, of course, coming up next. I'm quite excited about Liz Truss's intervention. This seems to have brought up the fundamental debate once more in the Conservative Party.
Absolutely. We had a good crack at it yesterday on growth. And what the leader, as you know, because you've been talking about it on the programme already, in the Sunday Telegraph says, is that the Conservatives need to have a fundamental debate about what it is that they stand for on growth. And she's obviously launched her attempt. Grant Shapps has put the boot into boarding, as well as Gavin Barwell and others. And she does talk about that orthodoxy and that reluctance of people to think outside the box, which was exactly what took your party to power at the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, and kept them there for so long. And it is about growth, it's about tax levels, it's about deregulation, it's about free markets. So great lineup of guests to pour over that.
I'm sure you have. Well, look, thanks to all my guests this week. Next week, we will be looking back on the week in politics and indeed on the pandemic and poverty. More lightheartedly, I'll explore the worlds of vegan chocolate and of Bambi. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Come back next week.
Hello again. Looking ahead, and there will be some wet and at times windy weather across northern parts, but further south it's going to stay drier and brighter, but with the risk of some frost and fog by night. Taking a look at the bigger picture, and you can see this weather front waiting out in the Atlantic. This is going to push towards the UK as we go through the next 24 hours or so, but at the moment we have this whacking great big area of high pressure across us, and that's why it's been such a settled day for most. Staying fine across much of England and Wales as we go through this evening, and with some clear skies through much of the night too, but a much cloudier picture across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, some blustery gusty winds and also a few spots of drizzly rain too. As a result of the cloud, it's going to stay quite mild here, but with the clear skies for England and Wales, turning cold with -4, -5 possible, so a fairly widespread frost and some freezing fog patches to watch out for first thing on Monday morning. Through Monday itself then, a bright start for much of England and Wales, but that thicker cloud towards the northwest is gradually going to encroach its way in, so many places turning a little bit cloudier, but I think it will stay sunnier towards the southeast, and here temperatures doing similar to today really, so highs of 9, possibly 10 Celsius. Also could get into double figures across the far north of Scotland because of that southerly wind. We could see some breaks across northern Scotland, but most places here staying quite cloudy. Through the end of the day on Monday, that weather front I mentioned earlier is going to push its way in, so a spell of more persistent rain and some strong winds reaching the far northwest of Scotland as we go through the night. Cloud keeping things quite mild here, but across England and Wales, again where we have the clear skies, it's once more likely to be a pretty chilly and frosty night. Again, temperatures getting to lows of -4, -5 perhaps, and again some freezing fog to watch out for as we go through Tuesday morning itself. Now taking a look as we go through the rest of this week, and it is going to stay quite changeable at times across northern parts, so some further rain to come, and it will be a bit windy too, but always dry and brighter towards the south, but here there is the risk of some frost and fog. Bye-bye.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
He's the king of breakfast TV and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes. Already to bless.
Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want a